All right, this week is Females and Fathers. This is a 15 slide show to replace the 2 hours worth of lecture that we missed this past week in September. I apologize for that, but I had another obligation come up, so here it is, the supplement for the week 4 reading from the McAdoo text. We have 12 pages from Siddhartha, and we have 19 pages from Livingston. I'm going to talk about those in the following slides. Week 4, here we go. First, I want to reorient you to where we're at in the semester. This is the 4th week. So we focused mostly on contextualizing in the first 3 weeks and continues into this week to contextualize and reorient ourselves to our own perspective and the perspectives of others. In week 2, we read text by Dr. Dodson, who is a scholar at Michigan State University, and her writing was about basic research, comparison of the historical context of research on African American family life, what's been done, what should be done, and everything in between. McAdoo does a good job of bringing in multiple scholars who write about different concepts, different topics, and approach subject matter of African American family life from different perspectives. Nobles in week 3 had a cultural perspective, and this is a little bit different than Dodson, who gave more of a comprehensive worldview perspective on our first week's reading. Scope of context is very important, and we need to ask ourselves what is relevant to the study of families. Obviously, I think our perspective and recognizing the perspective of others is important and relevant to our study of families. We have other aspects of study that are relevant to the study of families, which is time and history and the influences on function, contributing factors to outcomes, and defining the roles of the members of a family. This helps us create and maybe construct our own comprehensive definition of what family is. Then when we place culture into the conversation, we can ask ourselves, does culture produce families, or do families institutionally generate or regenerate culture? This is a question we asked ourselves in reference to the Moynihan Report, which we talked about extensively in week 3. And this was a cart before the horse or chicken before the egg discussion, where Moynihan points out some of the unfortunate outcomes that are occurring in predominantly black and underserved communities. But Moynihan unfortunately makes the assumption or the conclusion that the culture of the black communities is producing these outcomes, rather than vice versa, that the structure of the cities or the communities is producing the cultural outcomes, or that there's some type of clash there. He sort of overlooks that. So we have to, 50, 60 years after the fact, go back and critique his writing and his worldview and perspective. This is going to help shape your worldview when you critique others. That's helping you form a critical thinking mindset. So are you more inclined to see the social world in terms of its structure or function, or do you perceive the social world as a cultural mechanism? Neither is really wrong, but you just need to understand the connection to theories. Maybe you're a structural functionalist, maybe you're a cultural relativist, maybe you're an ethnocentrist. The choice is really up to you. You just have to construct a good argument, build evidence to support your worldview and your theory. You can't just be opinion-based in this class. This is a scientific class. One of the tools that we use in the course is a syllabus, It's a common educational tool that helps you, the students, understand the scope of context, especially the time and scheduling for our class. But I brought you a lean tool called the X Matrix, and that helps you, the students, understand the scope of context for the semester. It's essentially a plan that shows you how each week's lecture contributes to your priorities, objectives, and long-term goals, puts it into perspective. It shows you how this course contributes to your academic journey. Maybe your 3 to 5 year breakthrough objective is to graduate college. It also shows you how your academic journey, including this course, impacts your life. You know, if you graduate college, you'll get a good paying job. Maybe then you'll make a difference in your own community. Maybe you'll think reflexively. You'll develop a sociological imagination. And so the X Matrix tool helps align contributing individuals and defines roles for our semester, who is going to do what in terms of the lectures, the classroom activities, and how those activities then influence the outcomes of your priorities, your objectives, and your 3 to 5 year goals. The X Matrix is also a lean tool that helps students understand the scope of context for families. It helps us, if we use it right, determine how families function. We can give examples. The X Matrix does not apply to all families, but this is just a good example for one type of family. How does each function contribute to a family's priorities, objectives, and long-term goals? What are a family's priorities, objectives, and long-term goals? We write those in here if we were mapping out a family on the X Matrix. And how does each family's structure and function impact every family member's life? The X Matrix also aligns contributing individuals and defines roles for families. Now, that's a tool you can use to map out a family or map out the semester. We've been talking about those for a couple weeks, but I'd like to take a minute here to review the sociological perspective and the imagination that we have to use in this class. The sociological imagination is an essence of sociology. Keep in mind, though, that it's also a culturally relativist point of view. Why is the context of the sociological imagination important? That's because it helps us shift our perspective from just ourselves and our one point of view to another point of view, and in the process builds up an adequate view of a total society and all of its components. It helps guide us towards becoming critical thinkers, and it teaches students how to fish. It gives you critical thinking skills instead of just giving you the fish. It tells you where to look, how to catch the fish. Instead of just giving you information in books, it gives you critical thinking skills. And instead of just giving you the answers, it teaches you where to look for the answers. So you can ask yourself, what perspectives do you share with your peers, and what qualities are the same or what qualities differ among us? This week's topic is females and fathers. Now, I just want to give you an introduction that this past week I presented to Michigan Association of Healthcare Quality, and I focused on project management using lean tools, the same lean tools that I bring to you in terms of mapping out the course plan and also families. If you care to use the X Matrix, for example, to map out a family's defined roles, objectives, and priorities. At my presentation, I explained that the most important step in project management is defining the problem. Too many groups try to implement solutions first. Is a faulty way to go about it. For example, my current project at work outside the class is to cure a disease, but that's not really the problem. The problem is more poor implementation of the procedure that helps cure the disease. So we had to redefine the problem before we came up with a solution. I'll give you an example of my backyard right now. I have a squirrel that keeps eating all my bird seed. And one of the ways that I could solve this problem is I could exterminate the squirrel. But the squirrel is not the problem. The squirrel's just fine. He or she is doing their thing. hunting and gathering. Eliminating the squirrel is not the problem. The problem is probably where the bird feeder is. It's too easy of access. So the solution is to move the bird feeder to another place, not to eliminate the squirrel. So that's one example. That's going on in my backyard right now as we speak. Another thing to be aware of is that we need to look for new solutions, not only in terms of squirrel and bird feeders, but also the problems we face in our class, the social problems. Certain solutions might be new, and you cannot necessarily always use an old solution for a new problem. So our author for this week's reading, Nyara Sudharkaza, begins by distinguishing between problems and solutions. And this comic here says, in jest, this really is an innovative approach, but we can't consider it because it's never been done before. In other words, it's saying that commonly in the workplace we have to perform the status quo in order to get things accomplished, but this is not a good way to go about progress. Sudharkaza puts out 6 main points. The first one is to understand the structure through which African American families have evolved. And historically, African American families have embraced a single parent household, mainly with women as heads of household. This is a lot different than the Eurocentric, European, white, Protestant, male head of household model that is commonly assumed to be the American norm in our country today. Second point is that Sudharkaza makes, female-headed households differ in their functions. And this is important because we can't always assume that all black families are the same, not all white families are the same. And in terms of women-headed households, you could have an older, educated, employed single woman as a mother, head of a household. And this could be much different than a younger, unemployed black woman. So just because they share female-headed household title, their function could be much different, and the individuals that make up the household could be much different in their roles. Third point Sudharkaza makes is marriage is not equivalent to family. She mentions the importance of consanguine blood ties, and there's something I've mentioned a lot already, the difference between consanguine relationships and conjugal relationships. Consanguine meaning blood ties. So you could have a family that consists of a lot of cousins, aunties, uncles, etc., and there could be no marriage actually occurring in that family, and that's a totally legitimate family form and shape. So family is not equivalent to just a marriage, husband and wife. Fourth point Sudharkaza makes is that female-headed households are legitimate. Now we have to ask ourselves who validates and gives a legitimacy to the definition of family. A lot of times you're going to get a legitimacy from your church or from the government with the legalization of marriage. So the government institution, the religious institution can legitimize and validate the definition of family. But what if black family norms are female-headed households? What if that's a cultural norm? Who legitimizes that? If it's not the church or not the government, does anyone legitimize that or validate that form of a family? Fifth point Sudharkaza makes is female-headed households can occur even with men and marriage involved. So female-headed household does not necessarily mean single woman. It can mean a female-headed household where there is a man, and it could be a monogamous married relationship just headed by a female. And this should be a no-brainer. So female-headed households without men should be fine. Female-headed households with men, without men, they should just be, they should function well. I think if all the components are there that need to be there, determining those components is up to you, not up to me. Number 6, female-headed does not cause poverty. So just because a family is headed by a female does not necessarily mean that that family will be in poverty. That should be obvious, but policymakers often focus on female-headed households. You want to think of examples like WIC, Women, Infant, and Children programs. and other programs that provide maybe daycare to mothers. You have a lot of politicians right now talking about maternity leave, but not paternity leave. So female-headed household can be doing just fine. It does not necessarily cause poverty just because the household is headed by a female. So the first section of our reading, the take-home is that this form of female-headed household does not necessarily conflict with American norms or Christian family values. Just because a household is headed by a female, if there was a heterosexual, monogamous, conjugal relationship between man and woman, just because the household is headed by a female should not conflict with the other norms and values in different types of families that are considered normal in America. That's an assumption I make, but I could be wrong. So if we define families in terms of kinship and friendships, then we might look or perceive families in a different manner. We can ask ourselves, why are heterosexual conjugal relationships so important to some groups' definitions of family? For example, there is a bunch of what some might consider normal American Christian values, and we could list those. So monogamy, or be loving your children, close-knit ties to your family. These are all typical American family values or Christian family values, and none of those conflict with a female-headed household or value placed on kinship and friendship. These should be one and the same. So we can ask, how many of those typical American values rely on or are contingent on heterosexual conjugal relations? And very few, I think, are. You could correct me if I'm wrong. Then we can remember we are probably focused on function and should consider culture in this conversation. In other words, how are norms established and legitimized? Because these norms in female-headed households or African-American families should not conflict with other family norms, yet somehow they have been delegitimized. Female-headed households have been somewhat invalidated in our culture today. Going to the next portion of our reading, we can ask, what if we define families? What if we defined families in terms of kinship and friendship? That was on the last slide. If we had a less patriarchal society, then maybe these statistics wouldn't matter as much. Statistics like black males have children at earlier age than whites. If we had a more matriarchal society, that might not matter as much. There's a good chance that a black male's first child is not in a traditional family. Well, that shouldn't matter unless we put some type of incentive into traditional family forms. Black families are more likely than whites to be unemployed, and that only is a negative impact in a structure that values employment higher than kinship ties and relationships. Livingston and McAdoo do a good job of tying statistics to their arguments. They talk about the structure of America, where education is important, especially correlated with getting a job. They talk about the function of education, in that 16% of black males have a college degree compared to 29% of whites, so that's about half. Blacks with equal education get 70 cents on the dollar to whites, and that's surprisingly less than the 80 cents on the dollar that women get to men. So you might say that blacks are at a higher disadvantage than, or more of a disadvantage than white women or women in general are. Of note, female-headed households are the norm in many black communities, as you see in those statistics there. And so if we, as a country, looked at female-headed households as normal, then we would, it logically follows that we look at black families as normal if they're predominantly female-headed households. Conversely, if we look at male-headed households as normal, then we would delegitimize and invalidate the typical black family structure. So why do we have a patriarchal society? One answer might be capitalism, but that's up for debate. You know my stance if you listen to my lectures, but you can form your own stance and worldview and perspective. But when we have a society that involves money, that legitimizes value by who accumulates the most financial capital. And who accumulates the most financial capital is typically the male in our society. This is a point made in the reading, and we often take this as assumption and as fact. It's backed up in the reading. If we value other forms of social capital is a topic, a concept made popular and clarified by Robert Putnam and Pierre Bourdieu. Now, if we valued other forms of social capital, then we'd value mothers more. So if males are the breadwinner and we value bread in more ways than one, then we value males. But if we value kinship ties, nurturing, things other than money, then we're going to start valuing women more than men. And this is something where analyzing social capital exchange is relevant, important, and appropriate. When and where egalitarianism is devalued, black men suffer, and in America, egalitarianism is somewhat devalued. Therefore, black males' import in their lives are somewhat devalued. Until we start valuing egalitarianism and equality more, that's when black men would be more valued in our society. These are points made in the book, not just my own point of view. So you can think about it. If America tends to place a value on hard work, especially through the Protestant ethic, historically, it legitimizes the hard work that men and women in America do. It then also invalidates those who are unemployed. It devalues those who spend more time caring for children, and it devalues shared housework. So you should stop to think, when we incentivize more work, it means less time caring for children. And why do we do that? I might say it's because of industrial manufacturing economy that we live in. So I'm going to simplify it. This evening is a presidential debate. So I have a quote up here from one of the candidates' daughters who says that fathers and parents who adopt should not be eligible for paid leave. And black families might have increased fatherly involvement, so reducing their role delegitimizes the black family structure, generally speaking. Policymakers, especially candidates for president, can either focus on black fathers or they can choose not to focus on black fathers. Economic systems can either focus on egalitarian childcare or they can focus on divided, divisive, hegemonic forms of nurturing and childcare. So the other option, if it's not egalitarian, is divisive, devalued nurturing. So we need to look at what the candidates are saying, what the policymakers are saying, and who's placing value where. In terms of black families, placing value on the father's nurturing is somewhat different than what we have come to accept as cultural norms in America. Other points made by the authors, one quote is, if black unmarried fathers were more likely to live in close proximity to their children, they might visit them more often than white or Hispanic unmarried fathers. Keep in mind, I don't necessarily on the surface agree with all these points. I'm just conveying the text, and I'm not just voicing my opinion, but these authors have data that backs up their statements. And so this data support is much more scientific than any opinion. And you have to understand that when you back up data, or when you back up claims with data, it's not just opinion And these authors cite 5 studies at minimum when they make these points, that even if you're a black student in my class, you cannot just say this is true or that's true just by your experience. Same as true with whites. You can't say this is true, that's not true. You look at these statements like black parents are more authoritarian than white parents, and the authors on page 227 have studies that back that up. The authors also claim that fewer behavioral problems and better grades among low-income black children whose parents employed an authoritarian parenting style is true. They support that with studies. There's more evidence that kinship is important in black families and that black fathers are present even when they don't appear on paper to be present. So the final food for thought, one point made by Amato and Rivera in 1999 in the text suggests that fatherly involvement is usually determined through a mother's perceptions. Bring this back, remember what lens we're looking through, and this point comes in the section by Livingston and McAdoo about fatherly involvement in child outcomes. So who has the power to be having the biggest impact on child outcomes? Is it the mother? Is it the father? Is it the child? Is it the policymakers? Is it the religious institutional impact? Ask yourself, who determines the parenting styles? Is it a member of the family? Is it community norms, cultural, etc.? And who says what's best for the child? And how do we even know what's best for the child? These are all questions to ask yourself. And when we start to list the questions, we can identify our problems. We can develop new approaches to solve those problems. Old methods are flawed, okay? Circling back to my first slides where I talked about my presentation and I said the problem was not curing the disease, it was more of the implementation of the procedure that cured the disease. So the authors say that the methods used in earlier research on black people, in which most socially and economically challenged black communities are seen as benchmarks, it needs to be abandoned. We need to look at well-off black families and study and look at their qualities, their influences, their culture, their outcome, and their parenting techniques. New methods are needed to provide a clearer perspective on the current reality, and using old methods produce a distorted view of black communities. We need to discover what the new normal is. Bad qualities like poverty and crime are seen as norms rather than exceptions when using the old methods. So if we look at middle-class black families who aren't prone to criminal activity, this will create a new paradigm and a new approach and research methods. So the most important first step is defining the social problem. Remember the example of the squirrel, and the problem is not to eliminate the squirrel, but rather to place the feeder in a different location. So if I redefine my problem, I would redefine the cause and the solution of that problem. Remember that certain solutions could be new and never thought of before, and we cannot necessarily always use an old solution for a new problem. So that ends my 15 slides for this week, week 4, females and fathers. Course text from McAdoo, book title Black Families, Sudarkaza's section on African American female-headed households, and Livingston and McAdoo's section on the roles of African American fathers. Hope you gained something from this lecture. If you have any questions, you can email me and I'll be happy to answer those. In class this week, week 5, we're going to have a activity during class, which will complete our first reflection paper assignment. More on that during class. On Wednesday, I'll bring pizza. I'll bring apples from a local apple orchard, and I'll see you in class 3 o'clock on Wednesday. Thanks for listening. Hope you learned something.